is put a dollar value on how much violence costs the global economy. And every year it's around 16.5 trillion, which is around somewhere between 10 and 13% of total world GDP, or around $2,000 per person. And to put that into context, 1% of that 16.5 trillion is more than overseas development aid. 10% is more than is about 2 times the GDP of Africa. So the Institute for Economics and Peace, the reason we're doing what we're doing is not to be utopian and not to promote that we could ever abolish violence altogether, but making small inroads to reducing it can have some massive impacts. For those of you who don't know the Institute for Economics and Peace, we're an independent, not-for-profit think tank dedicated to building a greater understanding of the key drivers of peace, and as well as identifying the economic benefits that increased peacefulness can deliver. We're an international organization with offices in Brussels, The Hague, Sydney, Harare, Mexico City, and New York. And as Ahmet mentioned in our introduction, the Institute for Economics and Peace, we partner and consult to many of the major multilaterals throughout the world. We also work with a lot of university in terms of courses and producing curricula. And we have over 500,000 downloads of IEP reports over any sort of 12-month period. So to frame this conversation, as has been mentioned, I've been with the Institute for Economics and Peace for 10 years. Here are 3 things that we know from not just the Global Peace Index, but from a lot of the work that has been done by IEP and by organizations like IEP. Peace is more than just the absence of war. When we're talking about peace, many people just think about the absence of war as their definition. What a lot of academics, and certainly the work that the Institute for Economics and Peace does, is really try to communicate this point that peace is more than just the absence of the war, and certainly sustainable peace is more than just the absence of war. Peace takes a long time to build, but a short time to fall. And the third point that I think is useful to frame the conversation is that while falls can be dramatic, they're very difficult to predict. And some cases in point, if you have a look at the data of Syria before the conflict, Syria was improving on a whole range of development indices such as education, income, and health. All the data on Syria would suggest that Syria was improving and was quite a stable country prior to the conflict. If we have a look at something more recent, Ukraine, Gallup World Poll found that in 2021, Ukrainians were the most optimistic they'd ever been about the future. They were more worried about transport than war and/or terrorism. And they also had little faith that their government could handle a crisis. So not only is peace or falls in peace difficult to predict, even when you're potentially on the precipice of a quite major deterioration in peace, it's very easy for a lot of people not to really be aware of that. So with these things, how do we create sustainable peace? So in order to be able to measure peace, which is what the Institute for Economics and Peace has been set up to do, we first have to define it. And if we take that first point that I made, that peace is more than just the absence of war, how peace theorists and the academic literature thinks about it is there are negative aspects of peace. They are things you don't want. So you do not want interpersonal violence, you don't want violent conflict, you don't want war. But there are also positive aspects of peace. And these are things that you do want that create and sustain peaceful societies. And how the Institute for Economics and Peace does it is we look at both of these different aspects. In the Global Peace Index, which is what we're potentially most famous for, it's a negative peace report. It ranks 163 countries on the absence of violence and fear of violence. And then there's also our sister report, the Positive Peace Report, which ranks the same 163 countries on the presence of the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. So when IEP is talking about peace, we're talking about both these things. We're talking about the absence of violent conflict, but also the presence of strong institutions, positive attitudes and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. And how we think about positive peace through a whole range of statistical analysis, we've been able to identify 8 pillars of positive peace that we can say that the most peaceful countries are strong in. And they include a well-functioning government, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relations with neighbors, high levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, low levels of corruption, and sound business environment. And the most peaceful countries in the world are strong in all 8 of those. They also, being strong in all 8 of those, also comes with other benefits. They also tend to have higher per capita income. They also tend to be more resilient, so the ability to absorb and recover from shocks is stronger. They have better environmental outcomes. They have higher measures of well-being and better performance on the SDGs. So with that, I'll just go into some of the general findings and then open up for the general conversation. If we have a look at the Global Peace Index, the world is less peaceful than it was a decade ago. Ahmet sort of mentioned some of the stats, but if we have a look at the past 14 years, peace has declined 11 of those years, and it's significantly declined since around 2014. So what we're seeing since 2014 is a sort of quite dramatic decline in global peace. And if we think back, there are a number of sort of key factors that could be playing to that. One of the things that the Global Peace Index does is it tells the story through data and sort of allows you to play back over time. And if you visit our website, visionofhumanity.com, you can play the Global Peace Index over time to see what changed year on year. But the deteriorations are largely in increasing number of refugees and IDPs. It's the highest it's been and keeps on increasing since it's the highest it's been since the end of World War II. Political terror scale. So the political terror scale is a measure from Amnesty, which measures the amount of government restrictions that are in place in any one particular country. And over the past 5 years, and certainly since potentially since 9/11, that indicator has been deteriorating globally. And obviously, the past few years, it's been very apparent that the neighboring international relations and neighboring country relations has been deteriorating. One final point that I'll make just on the Global Peace Index and something to mention about the Positive Peace Index. I mentioned the Positive Peace Index is a measure of the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. If you actually break it out to the attitudes, institutions, and structures, and you compare the attitudes to institutions over that period, over the past decade, you see that generally institutions across the globe have been increasing and strengthening, but the attitudes towards them has been deteriorating, which is an interesting paradox. So on one hand, things are getting better institutionally and structurally. On the other hand, people's perceptions of them, perceptions of corruption, trust in government, trust in media, have been deteriorating, which is something that we're sort of working with the team at the Human Development Report with UNDP, trying to really sort of delve into the research as to why that possibly could be and what are the implications of that for global peace. So with that, I'll leave it there and pass back.
Before David finishes, can I ask him, please, what's been happening to Australia in the index over the last few years?
Sure. I mean, Australia always ranks, somewhere within the top 20 of the Global Peace Index. Over the past few years, however, it's dropped. Last year, it dropped 2 places. To now rank to 16 in 163 countries. The main sort of drivers of that have been in the militarization area. So while things like terrorism has deteriorated, incarceration, perceptions of criminality have all improved, our expenditure on the military is contributing to that deterioration. And I think it raises a good point as to the construction of the Global Peace Index and why military expenditure is in there in the first place. And the reason for that is that it goes back to the definition of the Global Peace Index that I mentioned. The Global Peace Index is the absence of violence or fear of violence. And so the Institute is not, as I mentioned, a utopian organization. We fully respect the military and respect its reason for being and, its necessity. But the reason that military spending is in the Global Peace Index is as a proxy for fear of violence, because it stands to reason if a country is spending more on its military, increasingly, it's because it has a perceived threat that it's trying to counter. So over the past few years, Australia has been increasing its military, which has been well documented in the media, and that is, in response to growing uncertainty within the region.
Thanks.
Thank you, David, for giving us that snapshot of where things are at, and particularly explaining Australia's position as well. So it's good to know where Australia stands in the Global Peace Index report. Katie, I wanted to bring you in, and being a person that focuses a lot on international affairs and your expertise areas of counterterrorism, I just wanted to get your thoughts on Afghanistan. It's obviously featured highly in the Global Peace Index for nearly 2 decades, albeit at the wrong end of the spectrum. The US and its allies went into Afghanistan sometime after 9/11 to go after Osama bin Laden and supposedly help build Afghanistan to being a democratic nation. How do you see things have unfolded there in the aftermath of the withdrawal of the US and allied troops from Afghanistan? And how would you rate the West's performance in building institutions to uphold democratic reform and stable political governance to create an environment of peace in a country that's got different ethnic groups? What's your view on that?
Thank you, Ahmed. And I'm really pleased to be here and to be able to have an opportunity to speak about this under this framework of positive peace, and how David has outlined that, we need to not look at just as, look at these markers of absence of what's in the way, but also looking at, what are the other drivers. And I think the human capital is a really, really important lens to be using here. And because when you're asking about the humanitarian or the situation in general, I think the humanitarian and human rights situation is rather depressing. And it also highlights what's been happening. I mean, we're having this discussion just one day after the anniversary of, the US withdrawal that, some describe it as chaotic or messy. But, I think it can also rightly be described as catastrophic, and especially seeing what that has led to, not just the scenes that are fresh in people's minds, and this anniversary of, that plane taking off and people clinging to it and falling to their death, and sort of bringing up similar images from Vietnam and the US, sort of the equally ungraceful exit there. But I think we have to also see it in this holistic way. What are the structures that sustain peace? And a lot of times, I think our lens on Afghanistan has been security, and we've looked at, it was the US's longest war. It was also, and we were by extension involved in that, and it sort of seems to highlight this dominance of a security paradigm, and everything else comes last, or comes, that's the overriding imperative that we're operating under. And then recently with the US killing of al-Zawahiri, Afghanistan came in the spotlight as, the question was, will it be another safe haven? Will it become a safe haven for terrorism again? And again, it overshadowed the other tools that are really, really needed for peace, such as diplomacy and economic assistance, or the nation building that was also underway. And I think what we've also seen was that a lot of times in the last 20 years in the efforts in Afghanistan, the objectives got confused. It looked like they were happening parallelly, that there was a security mission at the same time there was a nation building mission at different times, because also with NATO, under the NATO coalition, but that not always that these objectives were pursued in harmony, so that we would get, coming back to sort of those markers that David has outlined, that was the ultimate overriding objective, and that was sort of pursued strategically. And and with sort of a cohesive approach. And it's always, hindsight's a wonderful thing. We obviously didn't know. And it's very, very morally, it's extremely difficult for any administration, especially the US, who took the lead there to do what's right by your people, by your soldiers, and to also stand by your commitments to your allies, to your coalition partners. But I think that framing is really important there, and why that's not the easiest of questions to just answer with a few figures. And I mean, the latest, but just to come back to that, the tragedies, the human tragedies unfolding in Afghanistan since the withdrawal and preceding decades, they're really heart-wrenching. The recent crisis group report has found that conflict levels have actually gone down, which is interesting, because the war has sort of subsided into just sort of, I guess the indicators are looking positive in some way. What was detailed when we're going from this hot war situation. So there are some signs, but it's not really a given that those are lasting, that the structures have been built. The conflict kind of diminished, but at the same time, then humanitarian access to many parts of the country at the same time also diminished with the withdrawal. And then the COVID-19 pandemic has made that extremely difficult, and diplomatically, the dilemmas of recognizing the Taliban, the former enemy, the insurgent force, to now as a de facto government. And even if there's no official diplomatic recognition, how to work with them pragmatically. I think there was a recent article in the New Yorker, I think it's called sort of the foreign policy dilemma from hell. And I think, and also I think we should say it's also humanitarian, human rights dilemma, because how can we ensure that commitments to the Afghan people that were made, that they're not just left behind? At the same time, we don't want to entrench the structures that are also causing some of the other indicators that are making life extremely difficult. And I think that's a dilemma for individual states, nations, especially the ones that were so involved, but also diplomatically and multilaterally, where I'm sure John will have some really valuable insights.
Before we move to John, I just wanted to get your thoughts on, do you feel that the West made a sufficient investment into establishing institutions and try to put people there who are willing to make these institutions work, so that it is inclusive, it is representative of the many voices, the many groups that are out there?
Yes, I would have said that the United Nations fits that description very well. I mean, virtually all countries are members of the United Nations, or of any substance, and in fact they've been very active. We don't really get coverage of what's happening in much of the world in the Australian media, and this is really difficult. If you want to understand what's going on in the rest of the world, you really have to also read articles, or listen to, or watch reports that come from other countries. The United Nations has been very active, for example, in relation to Ukraine, and before the invasion occurred, there were a great many countries attempting to influence Russia, and some of them with quite a degree of diplomatic sophistication. And since the Russian invasion, there has been every month debates in the Security Council about what could be done. Of course, the Security Council is impeded by the veto, and since Russia is a member and has a veto, that makes it very difficult to pass motions. Although, by the way, the Charter does have a provision which says there should be a general rule that countries that are directly involved in the subjects under study should not vote in that debate. And I don't understand actually why that rule hasn't been applied in relation to Russia. It could have been. Anyway, there's an unused power there. Of course, there was a special session of a special emergency session of the General Assembly, which overwhelmingly condemned the Russian invasion and demanded immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. And 141 countries voted in favor of that out of 193. Only 5 countries opposed it and 35 abstained, which is a very strong condemnation of what Russia has done. The UN diplomats were also active in many ways, some of them reported, some of them not reported. Often the best peace-building operations are those which take place secretively. It's very important quite often to have countries able to say things to each other which will not be reported. It gives them greater freedom to seek compromises and so on. Anyway, that's one aspect of peace building technique. There has been one agreement at the UN with the help of Turkey, interestingly enough, about the distribution of food leaving from Ukraine and Russia. They are both major contributors to food in impoverished countries, and the hunger and malnutrition is enormous, partly as a result of the delay in distributing wheat and whatever else from Ukraine and Russia. Anyway, that agreement was made. The first weekend, Russia bombed the port that it was to have been dispatched from, but since then it has developed and is expanding, and that is profoundly important because there are major droughts in East Africa, for example, impediments to food production in many places. So another issue is, of course, what else has impeded negotiation, and one factor is that some countries, other than Russia, have acted in the same way, and those countries are the US, Britain, and Australia, because those were the 3 countries that invaded Iraq, contrary to UN law. They all took part in the invasion of Iraq, and they didn't have Security Council agreement to doing so, and none of them were being attacked by Iraq. And therefore, those 3 major countries which are fierce critics of Russia now did the same thing themselves in 2003. And that's something that we as Australians should be aware of and very ashamed of. One factor in Australia's under attention to peace building is simply that less and less as a proportion of total Commonwealth expenditure has been spent on diplomacy. Since 1995-96, the proportion of Commonwealth expenditure on diplomacy has been halved. It was 0.38% in 95-96. It's now less than 0.2%, a tiny amount. And it's enormously important that the new government has said that they'll increase diplomatic expenditure. And Penny Wong, the minister, was very challenging to the department and said she wants them to become more active, more ambitious in their goals for diplomacy, and she's going to clearly lead that process. So I think that trend is about to change, and that's enormously important in Australia making a contribution to peace building.
Thanks, John. Katie, I wanted to bring you back in and just get your thoughts on how we should view peace as a hybrid construct, because national security was initially characterized through the lens of counterterrorism, but we are now entering a phase of competing power paradigms. And many say the end result of the US foreign policy and security interventions have mostly failed to achieve policy ends at an acceptable cost, meaning the results were detrimental for long-term sustainable peace in those places of intervention. As John's mentioned there, as the US is reprioritizing and redirecting its resources away from those places, what effects do you see this having on peace in the former CT hotspots like Afghanistan or Syria that were focal areas of US efforts and resources? And should we be concerned that there will be even less needed attention now to crucial areas?
Yeah, absolutely, Ahmed. And following on from what John was saying, I think those places and the tragedies, the human tragedies, are just the challenges. They're asking us to sort of think a little bit further down the road, what follows after military engagements end, and that longer term vision is indeed needed. And I think that's where Australia can really show its strength as well, that it can have take more of a leadership role there, and that it can be a good ally and a good partner to the US, but also say, no, we're doing things differently. We have a unique geography, a challenge arising from our geographic strategic location here, and we also want to take some leadership in how we live those values and principles. And the questions of, maybe we've won the war, maybe not, but how do we actually win the peace? I think those are some questions that have been around, and they've been occupying debates on these very important ones. And I think they're also tied to debates about sort of the durability of American power and how we position ourselves there. And I think Afghanistan, again, I'm coming back to those images, because they're very, of the withdrawal, they're very hard to ignore. And the parallels to Vietnam, if they weren't sort of at the forefront of everyone's mind, I think certainly they were at the forefront of what are now termed our adversaries in this great power competition. I think we have to ask ourselves, how are we moving forward? There obviously, there is the military side going on. There are commitments to greater US military presence in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, and Australia is investing in that, in US forces in Australia's north, for example. But when we think a little bit more broadly, that's only one part of how we project national power. There are many other parts to that, and also diplomatically. And I think when we're talking about we're in a more contested or more fragile world, we have to make sure that those principles that we're espousing, they're not just hollow. And I think war can, and this notion of war and then positive peace, I think there is that element to it, that when we're looking at what political obligations stem from that, that's sort of where we should be focusing. I think that we're, in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, that's usually overlooked, or even if it's understood, it's not at the forefront of agendas. And I think that's where the big lessons from Afghanistan for Australian leaders also are, that strategic change asks us to recommit to those things in different ways. And everyone, I think it was a very obvious lesson that, that military commitment was not enough to tackle those challenges. But that we now have to look at, what are those key pillars of our strategic posture? And they have to do with, credibility. And the US, I think they like to use the word soft power. I think that might be a little bit, or smart power, as it's been retermed. I think that's difficult when it then gets lumped together with, what the US has actually done, and the criticism of, how have they actually committed to this? And what's, how are we positioning ourselves when there's now competition where actors like Russia and Ukraine will compete with us also in that domain of narratives and sort of ethical and normative posturing on that world stage? So I think that those are some really tricky questions that we need to have discussions on, because it's not as easy in Afghanistan to just send in aid. There are real dilemmas there of how to really be there. And coming back just sort of to end this positively, that human capital, we have to just think more creatively what we can do, how we can still engage, how we can ensure that Afghanistan, regardless of the conditions on the ground, this is something that the Australian great scholar of Afghanistan, Professor Bill Maley, has said, is that Afghanistan needs to live on as a nation, what Australia tried to help and build during all those years. We have a commitment to that. And if certain channels are not there anymore because we're not in the country, there are so many more things we need to look to doing. Is how can we foster civil society from outside? What initiatives do we need to do? And do we have to look at different kinds of engagements? And I think that is that positive angle that I'd like to end on, and also what comes out, especially what the Positive Peace Index should be about. And it's asking us to look for different avenues of how we use our national power to have those outcomes, so that's in line with our values.
Can I follow that on?
Yes, John.
By noting that there are 4 aspects of foreign policy, of which diplomacy is one, and aid is another, and defense is another, and intelligence is a 4th. And what's been happening in Australia during the last 10 years particularly is that the proportion of spending on the military, on defense, has gone up and up, and it's now pretty close to 10% of total expenditure, whereas expenditure on diplomacy is down, as I said, to 0.2%. It's minute compared to the military, and the intelligence agencies are also doing pretty well. Their funding isn't very much publicized, and aid has actually been cut. So that, and if you want to make an impact on conflict, then it's important to have substantial aid, because a lot of conflict comes from issues of access to land, access to food, cooperation between ethnic groups and so on, which can all be helped if the aid program is adequate. And Australia is now down to one of the meanest of the wealthy countries in the world. And if we wanted to make an impact towards creative peace, positive peace, then we would be substantially increasing our aid program as well as increasing our diplomatic program. I think they're very important issues.
They certainly complement each other, don't they, David? David, which I want to bring you in at this stage of the conversation, because we're at an interesting phase of human history, and as John and Katie have talked about, there is a bit of trust that needs to be built up again, and our reputation of being a leading nation that cares for, I guess, firstly in our immediate backyard, our region, is paramount to our future prospects and for our cordial relations with each of them. So how do we really dial in peace by investing into some of those infrastructures and those pillars that you talked about? I mean, based on what you've seen, David, what can you comment about, what factors contribute to sustaining peace locally and globally, and what must we focus on to ensure this life project called peace is an aspiration, but it's something that we can achieve parts of it? I know it means different things to different people, but the absence of war is a clear definition of it. But there need to go beyond that, as per what has been discussed already. How do we dial in peace and invest into these institutions and invest in our peace?
Great question. And I think, you've touched upon my response. It's understanding that peace is more than just the absence of war. And I think maybe the best way I can end on again a positive note with that message is a lot of the work that that IEP has done through its research. We're actually very active in operationalizing. So I'm the director of research, so all the reports and all the research that goes into them, I sort of oversee that whole process. But there's another side to the Institute for Economics and Peace, which is our partnerships and workshops programs that takes that research, and particularly the positive peace research, and operationalizes it, has a programmatic arm where we run a whole range of positive peace workshops, one to train people on the message that if you're going to build peace, it's more than just the security lens, it's more than just the absence of war. But also, in recognition that a lot of peace building, successful peace building initiatives are from the bottom up, not from the top down. So really going at the community levels and training them on the research that IEP has done, and asking them to does that apply to their local context, and if so, how? What's the most the most appropriate way of applying that? And if I can just give an example, we've been doing these across the globe and all different regions of the world. I particularly have been involved in workshops in the Middle East, but this particular example I'll give is from our region. There was a sort of area within a region that was having violent conflict, a history of violent conflict between two sort of militias. And the parties latched on to positive peace as a way of maybe tackling this ongoing historical conflict. Now, the way that we promote the people use the positive peace framework, the 8 pillars, is exactly how they analyze the situation. They had a look at what was the levels of human capital within the region, what was the underlying drivers of the conflict, how was governance throughout the conflict, whether it be formal or informal, being undertaken, were there elements of corruption involved in the conflict. And so they analyzed it through those 8 lenses, and they found one of the lenses that was severely lacking in this conflict was an ability for the conflicting parties to actually talk to each other. And that came through in the free flow of information pillar. They realized that even if the two parties wanted to talk to each other, there was no safe or trusted line of communication that existed for that particular conflict. So as a part of that positive peace analysis, they set up a channel of communication. I believe it was just a very simple phone line that allowed whichever party wanted to chat to the other one, a safe and secure line of communication. And through that, a lot of negotiations started being brokered. And as a result, some progress was made between in reductions of violence in the coming sort of months and years, and that process is ongoing. So I think the positive aspect of the positive peace framework is it is different. Every conflict is different. Every context is different. And the Institute for Economics and Peace doesn't purport to have the answers to every conflict, but the framework itself is general enough, it's simple enough that most conflicts can be analyzed within those 8 lenses. Strengths and weaknesses and ongoing feedback loops can be sort of simply understood, and glaring omissions to peace building objectives can be quickly highlighted. So that's how I would sort of respond to that. Is the positive peace framework? It's free, it's open source, it's there for everyone, and it offers a good lens to think through potential solutions to peace building issues.
Okay, David, while I got you, the first question may be directed to you, asking, is there a theory or calculation to determine how long it took for positive linear peace to emerge after the peace MOU was signed?
Well, I mean, I can tell you there's been a number of studies on peace agreements around the efficacy of them, if I can use that word. And the stats aren't particularly good. I think last time that someone did a study on it, 50% of conflicts re-emerge within 10 years of signing a peace agreement. And there are a whole range of different factors that people purport to the strength of any one particular peace agreement. One of them being, are all the parties involved, particularly when you're talking about non-state actors. It is not uncommon that non-state actors are not at the negotiating table at peace agreement negotiations. So the whole series of research papers that have been tabled on the strength of peace agreements. But yeah, I mean the stats to date are not particularly strong.
Okay, here's another question from a viewer, and sort of touches a little bit on the comments that were mentioned earlier about AUKUS. But to what extent, if any, does this conversation connect to globalization of thought and cementing of new multilateral movements, such as the formation of AUKUS, such as the BRICS formation? So we're seeing nation states aligning with other like-minded, maybe politically, governance similarity or similar structures, those sort of states coming together, those leaders coming together. What does that mean for future global peace when you have these little blocks being formed in different parts of the world? You've got NATO, you've got BRICS, you've got AUKUS. So that's open to anyone to answer.
I think there's a trend away from globalization at present. There's been articulation of nationalist goals in many countries. That's certainly true of the United States. It's certainly true of China, but the smaller countries too. I think it's been a tendency, so that the thought that globalization would be a major factor leading to greater stability, greater economic success in many countries has tended to fade a bit. Of course, it is a significant factor because of the growth of trade, and it is the growth of trade that's contributed enormously to growth in a great many countries, including all the larger ones. But there is also a trend underway at present that military expenditure in many countries is rising, and the IEP index will show this, I'm sure, and that this is really counterproductive, because the effect of increasing military expenditure, which it is argued by armies and so on, that it will increase security, often doesn't have that effect. In many ways, it reduces security, because it provides a motivation for other countries to also increase their military expenditure. And it can arguably be counterproductive to be increasing military expenditure in the way that is going on at present. I think it's very important that we get back to a stage where there's more attention to attempting globalized disarmament. Now, that's very complex, very difficult, and a bit utopian even to talk about that. But nevertheless, it is counterproductive for everyone seeking to be better armed and armed in more sophisticated ways when that simply encourages others to do the same thing.
Thanks. Another question came in saying that culture plays an important role in conflict. How do we go beyond the ethnocentric approaches and create new encounters that can synthesize in commensurate cultural differences? So how do we look beyond the ethnocentric approach and create new paradigms, new encounters that look beyond the cultural differences?
Maybe I could jump in there. I really like this question, because I think it often gets neglected that we have those lenses on, that they've been, the dominant ones. It's quite obvious that certain perspectives and voices get neglected there, and I think it connects to what John was saying earlier. I do see that there's also a chance for different realignments, because I think we're seeing that this, the structural drivers of globalization, they have resulted in fragmentation. I was talking earlier on about this fragility in the international system and sort of the US-led post-war architecture and multilateral order that we've had. But at the same time, it's not just across the board a return to inward-looking, nationalism, as was initially sort of expected when earlier discussions about globalization. Which is not, I don't think that's what John meant, he would, but I think this current moment, what stands out to me is that there is contestation of the legitimacy of multilateral processes for that very reason. That connects to the question that there's been this unilateral moment that led to these multilateral processes actually just being very US-centric and by extension Western-centric. And there's a lot of pushback against that we're seeing also at the institutional level, and we're seeing sort of the counter, we're seeing different groupings emerging. For example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that's Shanghai Spirit, that was I believe that was sort of a few weeks even before the 9/11 attacks, that was already being consolidated and has been developing since. And there's every time I think the West now, it seems that there is a new grouping or a new, alliance, there is a push against that. And we're seeing sort of the rise of what's called Eurasian geopolitics, where those nations go together and say, we have, we're representing an alternative view. We obviously have to see that from a there again, this merit in looking at overlapping perspectives where the cultural is there, that also gives rise to your strategic culture and to your strategic outlook. And I think that's a really interesting and exciting space to watch, and again highlights this point that we can't look at things in a one-dimensional way where the path to peace has to be, through military, or that there is that we need to look at these things more from what the connections are between culture and security and strategy, and laying those sustainable structures for peace.
Surely it's valuable when countries cooperate in alliances. The problem can come when one is very dominant and has a tradition of high military expenditure and seeking military power, but for Australia, for example, it's very important that we develop cooperation with Indonesia and the Southeast Asian countries and so on, and we'll all be more secure if we make that combination effective.
If I maybe just may add to that, and I think that also makes the case for really making sure that it's not a top-down process. Coming back to Afghanistan, that Doha peace agreement, that was diplomacy, but at the same time, also coming back to what David was saying, were all the relevant voices represented in that, or was that a top-down agreement? I think a lot of the trajectory that we've seen has to do with how that was being done, especially under the Trump administration, and the dilemmas and the problems that the Biden administration inherited from how that trajectory was set. And I think it has to do also with how we commemorate things and the active memory that we have in our nation, sort of connecting that, that very abstract macro level of international relations and security at that, UN level, but to also coming down to our societies. And I think we should sort of consider, we're talking about more diversity in foreign policy and international relations or national security. And I think it would be really important to look at, have we had a predominantly white male foreign policy? That's changing. And I think the signs from Minister Wong's foreign policy has already set the right signals, but and also putting higher emphasis and changing the rhetoric that it's more inclusive, but also being followed up by action. And I think I could think of more voices, coming back to Afghanistan. I guess I'm using it as a case study a little bit. We have people that have spent decades of their careers, of their, blood and sweat and tears into there. And there would be so many perspectives flowing from that and how that can follow in. I think there is a responsibility also in our societies that we connect, our memory and our education, that those perspectives are included, or what it feels like growing up in Australia, marginalized, and how, foreign policy from a marginalized perspective would actually look like, what the priorities would be. And I think that's where we're seeing, hopefully there's an opportunity for making greater connections. And, that is sort of a little bit in that ideal, in that utopian idealist realm. But I think some of the examples that David's been using, we often, I think they're really good, because we often think that these kinds of initiatives, they're for developing countries, but I think we could equally apply that to our own classrooms and teach our children what that means, and the contestations around including these diverse voices, or if, there's National Sorry Days, more tokenism, and what more needs to happen, that there are those perspectives. Whose foreign policy, whose security is this, it's for all Australians. And I think I do think we're seeing shifts there. And that hopefully something like the Doha failed peace agreement will in the future look like more what's happening in some of those places, like, let's say, the Philippines with the Bangsamoro peace agreement, where, that it had to include those voices. And I think we can take some lessons there, that high politics and high diplomacy don't always get us there.
Yeah, that's true. I think with the new generation, they're looking at the world and seeing what's happened in the past, and they're looking at the future with great optimism and opportunity. So hopefully a lot of those things will be able to be realized in the near future, so that we can hand over a more prosperous and hopeful future for them. With that comes to the end of our questions, but I just want to finish off and invite all of you to Utopia Land and say that if you were given infinite resources and infinite power and will, what one thing would you like to change, or would you invest in to work towards peace? And just short, quick responses. It may be something that you said already, or it could be something that's completely left field. So we'll finish off with that. So anyone want to go first?
I'd like to go first and say that I think we should be spending significantly more on peace building. And that's both official diplomacy and the training of official diplomats, but also peace building by non-government organizations. Lots of people want to be secure, but they'll be secure more as there are peaceful solutions to conflicts. And there's a great deal of learning that's available, but it needs to be allocated. Funds need to be allocated to developing it.
Thanks, John. David or Katia, would you like to comment as well?
I mean, I can jump in there. Obviously, if I had infinite resources, positive peace is something to strongly invest in. But if I had infinite resources, I wouldn't neglect that one of the pillars of positive peace is equitable distribution of resources. So it would be thinking through what is an equitable distribution of infinite resources, which would probably go a long way to solving many peace building problems.
I agree, very much so. And Katia, last word?
Yeah, I think I'd stick with sort of that educational theme. I think if we invested more, in addition to all these more concrete things, in how we remember things, the tragedies, if we really believe that, I guess, how we ended that war and how we remember it and whose voices are included in that, I think a lot of the tragedies of the next wars could probably be prevented or mitigated. And I think that broader discussion, I would feel that those efforts need to happen parallelly, including, for example, if we're commemorating the sacrifices made by soldiers, by the ADF, we would equally include the voices of people from those countries, and that it becomes a joint effort. And it's more, the framework we're giving it is more about the future and some of the ideals that were being fought for, and how we can carry that forward.
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much to all of you for your insights, your wisdom, your knowledge. We really benefited greatly. And no doubt, this is just one cog in a great chain of conversations about peace. It's an aspiration. We're hoping one day it will be normative, but we know that that's going to be a bit of a long boat to pull because of the competing factors that are at play. But nevertheless, I'm sure people would have been able to take something away from this conversation. I'd like to also thank all our viewers for joining us as well. And until we meet again, thank you again and see you next time.